So the following is a conversation I had with Ghaidaa Hetou. Ghaidaa is the founder of iStrategic, a business intelligence firm that analyzes political risk for the MENA region, which is the Middle East, North Africa. Ghaidaa is an expert on the geopolitics and geoeconomics of this region, and it was for this reason that I was so excited to get a chance to talk to her. Discount the role of the Middle East and Africa at your peril. They are the bridge between Asia, Europe, and Africa. Three regions, which I think you will agree with me, are not going to diminish in the relevancy over time. Or if they do, we have much bigger problems on our hands. There is so much exciting stuff happening in this region that it was an impossible task to sort of fit everything into an hour. But I'm sure Ghaidaa will return in the future to double down on our understanding of this fascinating region, the MENA, Middle East, North Africa. My favorite part of the chat was my realization that China's Belt and Road Initiative is actually far more than just a series of highways and railway lines. So make sure you stick around for that. Ghaidaa is extremely insightful on this topic. If you're listening to this on the Geopolitics and Power podcast feed, then let me suggest that we share some interests. I would say we have more in common than we do not. It all stems from my website, Atlas Geographical. And from there also is the main podcast, an interview podcast where I'm having on guests beyond just geopolitics and geoeconomics and geography, and talking a little bit about the political inflections of the world, cultures, and so forth. There is more happening on these channels. So let me suggest that if we've managed to find this niche together, then we perhaps share a few more interests in common as well. So please, if you are interested, go onto the website, and if you are so inclined, join the newsletter, or just see what's there. If it doesn't tickle you, fuck it, that's fine. Just stick around here and pump your good juice into the algorithm, guys. And I really hope you enjoyed this chat, because if you're into geopolitics, I mean, this is bread and butter stuff. All right, that's all from me. Here is my conversation with Ghaidaa, the founder of iStrategic. Well, welcome, Ghaidaa Hetou. Thank you so much for giving me some of the time and joining us on the podcast here.
Of course, I'm very happy to join you on your podcast, Ryan. Very happy to be here.
All right, well, really excited to hear what you're thinking about the MENA region. Obviously, we have a lot of questions regarding it, but just to start or sort of issue a point of authority from where you're coming from speaking about these topics, could you explain a little bit about how you became the founder of a political risk firm?
Sure. First, my name is Ghaidaa Hetou, founder and principal of iStrategic. It's a consultancy company based in the US, based in New Jersey, with association across the Middle East and North Africa region. We focus on political risk analysis, political risk mitigation strategies to support a corporation's successful market entry, and sustainable operations in the host country in MENA. A little bit about me. I was born in Damascus, Syria, grew up in Germany. Then my family moved a little bit Saudi Arabia. Then I moved to Syria for a while. After that, I moved to the US in the late 1990s. All the while traveling across the Middle East and Europe. I've always been passionate about the MENA region, its rich culture, history, complexities, and potential. I had the opportunity to study and earn 2 master's degrees and a PhD in political science in the US, focusing on security, foreign policy, strategy, and political risk in that region as well. And then I founded, go ahead, Brian. Yes, go ahead.
No. Please don't let me interrupt you.
All right. I founded iStrategic in 2013 with the aim of providing context intelligence and political risk assessment in MENA. While the region is a sizable consumer base, educated population, is definitely resource rich, it also suffers from various risk factors that usually prompt corporations to be risk averse and try to limit or avoid investment opportunities. So MENA, obviously, as I'm sure you know, is a unique geopolitical space, and it's far from being a monolith in culture and political systems, regulatory frameworks, and socioeconomic drivers. Each country has its unique points of strength and weaknesses, and local knowledge backed by data is better equipped to identify and anticipate. In addition, located at the crossroads between Asia, Europe, and Africa, and surrounded by crucial maritime trade routes, the Middle East and North Africa region is ripe with geopolitical intrigue, and it will never cease to be of interest to the private sector and government agencies alike.
Well, look, there's definitely a lot there. I'm sure we'll delve into a little bit the misconception of the sort of Middle East monoculture, because it is you haven't really taken a second to think about it much if you're under the opinion that they are all just the same, one big culture, think the same things, believe the same things. But interestingly about yourself, so born in Damascus, raised in Germany, you said a little stint in Saudi Arabia, obviously adult life in the United States. You said there was a little period where you went back to Syria before the early 1990s. Where do you most identify as home?
Oh gosh, what a big question, right? Well, home, yeah, that's a big question. Now home, now having family and grown kids in the US, I believe us to be home, right?
Okay.
But I always have affinities in Syria. That's absolutely my birthplace. Relatives live there. A lot of emotional connection goes back to that home state. But yeah, where is home? Yeah, I feel that looking at my kids growing up and just flourishing in the US and having lived here more than 23 years, more than half my life. Yeah, I see myself that I long to this home in the US, in New Jersey. Yeah. It's an important question, though.
Yeah, and I totally understand why it might be a difficult one to answer, because you have informed into your worldview three distinctly different cultures: the Syrian, the German, and then the American. And I just wonder, maybe from your life, and now I'm just sort of projecting and just making an assumption, but having lived in these different areas and seeing just how differently people might think about the exact same thing, is that what sparked maybe an interest in the geopolitics and the cultural differences?
Yeah, well, certainly that emotional link to Syria, but also the upbringing in Germany. It had a great effect on shaping how I saw things and how I felt. How personal discipline shaped me. How the school system in Germany, being in the Catholic school. I mean, there's a lot of resilience built in, a lot of discipline built in, and the stark contrast, especially when we moved from Germany to Saudi Arabia. I mean, there's a whole lot there that speaks to the 180 degrees in everything, socially, communities, schools, right? So it brought to me, it widened the horizon in how I see the world and how much can be considered relative and logical and make sense, but from different perspectives. And I learned to respect that. I learned to learn it and integrate it and make it part of the larger consideration of what people consider to be relative to their interest. What do they consider important in their lives, right? So it definitely broadened my horizon, especially that stark contrast between Germany, Saudi Arabia, US, Syria. I mean, those are, if you put them as focal points, there's a large space between them. And within that, there's a lot of integrated understandings, perspectives, cultural sensitivities and such. So there was a lot there. And I believe, it definitely contributed how I respect the differences and how, common sense is usually locally governed. And right. And that it brings it home. I mean, traveling, living for a long time in certain contexts brings it home that, common sense is just from a local perspective always.
That's a great quote. Common sense is locally governed. Did that just come off the top of the dome, or is that something you've written about or said before?
I believe in a magazine interview I mentioned that before, but I truly believe that it's locally governed.
I think there's a lot in there. Do you mind just opening up on that for a moment, explaining? Yeah, because I think that does say quite a lot in a very fine maxim.
On what in particular?
That a culture's common sense is locally governed.
If I ask you, Ryan, what are your current preferences, views on life regarding your friends, your career, your future, how you see yourself in 10 years?
Here we go.
How was that shaped, really? It was shaped beginning from your birth in a certain family, your parents, your siblings, your environment, neighborhood, school, right? So a lot of things have shaped you and your perspective on life. Now, give that a multiplier effect and apply that to societies and countries across the world. Their preferences, social stance, economic development level is shaped by their history, right? So that history is really what defines the local caricature and the local characteristics for each country. They're different from place to place, right? As they are different from one person to the next, shaped by everybody's very unique, path dependency of history, evolution, developments, crisis, recovery from crisis, how they recovered from civil wars and so forth. All of that shapes them in their current status. And can you really have a cookie cutter replication of policy propositions from country to country? I mean, that's a very, maybe a little bit of an ignorant way to go about it. I mean, it doesn't certainly show respect for the depth of the background of each country. And I truly came to respect that.
Yeah, we are but an accumulation of our individual experiences, aren't we?
Absolutely. Aggregate.
And so, as you say, the cookie cutter policy response is not the same for any two individuals, let alone any two neighboring cultures who have their own economic interests, their own cultural histories, their own, internal battles, whether it be, again, cultural or political, so forth. But yes, common sense is locally governed. I really like that. I'm going to plagiarize the hell out of that.
Oh, you're more than welcome.
Look, let's look into some of the geopolitics. Determining political risk requires such a multifaceted view of things. That's quite inherent, I imagine. How do you collect and then synthesize information to make your various assessments?
Okay, so we really focus on data and facts and information. That's definitely part of the foundation of how you go about things. And the secret formula that I like to pursue in every project is that I integrate in the team professionals, data analysts, but that are from the region, right? So they combine the professional data analysis dealing with facts, with spreadsheets, with data, and that they know how to integrate it, whether with regression analysis, with other types of methodology, but they also have that intangible sensitivity to information to, separate the noise from the signals. What really makes sense and is relevant in this case, because only they, from that cultural perspective, they know what to think. Oh, that makes sense. Oh, that doesn't make sense, right? Like from an outsider perspective, looking just at the raw data, they would think everything is relevant, right? Because it made a signal. Now we have to integrate it somehow, although all the combination might not make sense. But for someone from the region and a professional, it makes that perfect combination between local knowledge and professional attitude towards facts and data. And that's how we go about it. So first we have a certain set of risk factors that that span from economics, social, political, and threat assessment. And then that's in the macro view. From the micro view, we also include sector-specific risks that have to do with whatever the project is about, healthcare sector, IT sector, infrastructure sector, and so forth. And then we combine it with our risk modeling software, and then we look into scenario analysis. We basically make sense of future evolution or development of the current circumstances. So we're not only reporting of what the current circumstances are, but what the evolution and development and the emergent future conditions that might evolve in that particular location. So the corporation basically has a set of scenarios that they can incorporate in their capabilities in order to be like a step ahead of the anticipated developments we have put in front of them. So that's basically the wide brushes of how we go about things.
Sure. I like how you sort of in thinking about separating the noise from the signal. If one isn't, say, on the ground and experiencing the signal, as it were, firsthand to actually determine whether it truly is signal, you can easily fall into the trap of just being a victim to a very convincing argument, because I fear perhaps when I, make my judgment about, say, China, or my judgment about Latin America, or even my judgment about maybe the US, places where I'm not actually in, Taiwan specifically, I make lots of judgments about Taiwan, places where I'm not physically at. I'm just afraid that I'm being maybe taken for a bit of a ride from a convincing argument, because I'm not there to test the theory in person. And so, yeah, I can imagine. I mean, you're the person in charge of a political risk firm, so you know better than any of us. But basically, having someone there to collaborate the information, to test the information, to run it by people in real time, that's the real difference, isn't it? Like, that's where the true knowledge comes from.
I think so too, because if you think about it, Ryan, what determines what is convincing to us, right? What makes us mobilize our resources, elevate our threat assessment, all those things, right? All those commotions and processes. It has a lot rooted in our psychology, right? In our cognition, in our heuristics, and how was that built from our own experiences, right? And that path tendency. So it is very crucial to sift that out. And at least I know that in teams, in very functional teams, you must have a wide variety of professionals, but please include people from the region, because they're gonna shortcut a lot of junk and noise that's just going to dilute or taint the final product of the policy. Have them on board, have them just sift through and tell them, oh, that absolutely is not relevant in our context. Please include it or replace it. So what is convincing to us has to be re-examined, right? Because it is a form of a bias.
Yeah, it's like the classic failure of the consultancy firm who deliver a proposal and a solution 20,000 kilometers away across an ocean. It makes a lot of sense where they are based on the information they have. Yeah. But all it took was one very, rudimentary, like low barrier to entry signal from just being in the area. So something they see, a small conversation they have, like something little that they could notice, and it will disprove this entire argument beforehand.
Yeah, and that is probably the most drastic form of disengagement, or being not aware, right? Not aware of context intelligence. But I think most consultancy firms, the far range of respectable ones, definitely engage in the region, have headquarters in Dubai, for example, and other areas. Yep. So I really have, increasing respect for a range of them that are very much aware of what you mentioned, and the wide scope of how much that affect outcomes, not just for corporations, but think about NGOs, think about government agencies that rely on that intelligence, right? Yeah. So yeah, that's hopefully there's greater awareness about this point.
Sure. So there is this argument, the geographical determinist argument, one which I do not subscribe to, but nonetheless, it sort of presumes that a country is determined by its geography. All right. Now, obviously, there are many other variables that come into it, as we both know. But nonetheless, I really wanted to hear your thoughts on what the major geographical considerations are that we need to take into account for the MENA region.
Oh, there are a number of them. You think about, for example, the geographic location of the Red Sea and the two choke points, if you would like me to talk about that a little bit. The Red Sea, for example, is a critical pathway linking the Mediterranean Sea with the Indian Ocean, with 700 billion of seaborne commerce traveling through each route, with various military bases and regional and great power rivalries playing out. Red Sea geopolitics, for example, is certainly an area to keep a close eye on. Another areas, for example, you can look at China's foreign direct investment in 2019. We're around $240 billion in the region compared to 75 billion FDI from the US. The BRI project, obviously, is one of those geographical considerations, because it spans from China to Europe to integrate a large swath of Africa and the Middle East. Another one, it would be, just focusing on where the location of the crisis points are in their proximity to major metropolitan areas and trade hubs. Like, for example, the instability in Libya, which resulted in migration to crisis in Europe, disruption oil production, European states, especially Italian interests were affected. In addition, for example, the role of PMCs, the private military corporation.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot there, right? That is
Okay.
especially part of the development in the last 10 years. You look at Tunisia and Algeria, sometimes you have countries that on the surface, right, display a stable condition, but there are a lot of under the surface risk factors that are playing out in Tunisia and Algeria, for example. And then on the extreme end, you have Syria, Iran, and Lebanon. They score very high on the State Fragility Index, which in turn affects not just humanitarian needs, but also including refugee influx to Europe, overall ability to state to do the basic function. There are so many, Ryan. There's the Yemen war and the proximity to Bab el-Mandeb, and that's a significant crisis point. I mean, just this morning, you can think about what happened, for example, the smoke rising from the SSW vessel of Saudi Arabia Aramco just this morning at Ras Al Najis in Yanbu terminal. And it was caused by a radio-controlled, waterborne, improvised explosive device. And it was,
wow. I didn't see this.
Okay. Yeah, from Houthis in Yemen. So you can see that the security concerns are chronically heightened, not just in the Red Sea, but also at this, the Gulf and the Hormuz Strait up across to the East Med, right, East Mediterranean region, and all that dispute between Turkey and Greece. They are off the coast of Somalia, again, with another set of crises. So there are a lot of crisis points that are geographically, strategically located just to ensure that monitoring and staying up to speed with those developments is absolutely crucial.
Well, there's definitely a lot there, but I think that's more speaking to maybe the geopolitical hotspots. Right. I really want to hear from you, or just an explanation of the geography. What are how does understanding the geography help us to understand the MENA region?
Oh my goodness. So you have a territory that is spanning from Morocco on the Atlantic Ocean to Oman on the Arabian Ocean and the Indian Ocean, and north from Turkey and Europe to the Horn of Africa, Somalia. So that's the absolute linkage point, right? The linkage point between Asia, Africa, and Europe. If that is not the place to be, as far as geographic location, right? Location. I mean, that is the
good real estate.
Absolutely. But unfortunately, also that attracts a lot of competition, a lot of rivalry, because you are really interested now for China, for example. This is an absolutely connective space for them, for the BRI, for example, connecting East Asia to Europe. How else can you connect those two without having tremendous amount of billions of dollars invested in that region? How can you connect oil transport pipelines, right? Oil and gas pipelines. How can you ensure safe maritime trade if you're not having, an overview or certain kind of influence and leverage in the Red Sea, in the Indian Ocean, and in the Mediterranean? I mean, it's a linkage area, and there's absolutely, I mean, if you want to talk about geopolitics and you're not talking about the Middle East, then and you're missing, then there's a problem, because that's precisely where geography is playing the greatest role in the politics of the region.
And as long as we're going to be trading with each other, the MENA region is always going to be sort of front and center of our minds, unless the Western continent decides to split off from the Eastern continent, and they can live their own little lives. But
go ahead, Ren.
No. I'm just going to move on to another question. So I don't know if you had another thought you wanted to say.
No, just thinking about, remember that argument that said, oh, we're going to move away, or our interests will move away from the Middle East because the world is moving away from oil, dependency on oil, the renewable energy. But think about every other thing that is dependent on oil. For example, I mean, just another example. I mean, I guess the worst thing you could do to oil is to burn it for energy. But there are so many petrochemical productions that are waiting to be discovered and exploited. And also, I mean, planes, ships, what else can not only depend on oil. So the whole idea is, I think, a weak argument. There are many other reasons why this region remains to be a focus of great powers, not just because of oil, but because of that real estate, that geographic location. Precisely.
Yeah. And if we dig into the demographics a bit, this might go on a bit of a tangent, but demographically, it's one of the MENA region as a whole, I suppose, has an extremely young population. A year on year, a better educated population. Like they are a force of the future as much as they are a force now, and they have been in the past. It is not an area that's going to sort of wean out of significance.
Absolutely not. I mean, look at the thousands of people that migrate from the region to Australia, to Canada, to Europe, to America. The majority of them really succeed. I mean, either in professionalism, doctors, engineers, ITs, or entrepreneurs. I mean, so the soul of the people that occupy that region, once they get an opportunity to better governance, better circumstances, I mean, there's a lot there to be hopeful about. But of course, I mean, a lot of things are out of the control of, and it will have to go through an evolutionary development stage that might be slow because of many circumstances. But I'm optimistic like you that there's a young generation that is thriving to have better living circumstances. But hopefully, governance issues, corruption, and other risk factors will find their will get phased out with better circumstances, hopefully.
Yeah, it feels like the one major, and it's a major barrier, but the one major barrier is the political instability of the region, because it has every other variable input to a thriving economy, culture, country. It's just this giant roadblock.
Absolutely. Agreed.
But I mean, yes, it'd be interesting to comment more on the PMCs. I don't know much about that. But I wanted to ask, I wanted to also make a comment about the, something that doesn't get, I suppose, thought about enough is I'm here in Europe, I'm here in Stockholm. There's lots of talk about the amount of Middle East migration that comes into Europe. And in America, the amount of Latin American migration that comes into America. But what isn't considered in that is that we're the last port for a lot of the migration. What happens immediately is, say, I think it was like 10 million Syrians went into Lebanon, something like that. Yeah. That is, I mean, as a percentage of your population, it's migration that in Europe and America we're not familiar with. In Mexico, right? I've always made this argument, like a pro-Mexican argument, is like, yeah, America has a problem with illegal immigration, and when you have an illegal migration, they'll work for a little bit less. They'll work for some cash. They become, more. They become better labor, I suppose. Someone that you're more interested in hiring as labor. Mexico is the exact same problem, because from whether it's El Salvador, whether it's Venezuela, whether it's Colombia, Guatemala, they're coming up into the country, and then they're being stopped at the U.S. border, and then they go into Mexico, and then they have their own illegal migration problem as well. So, and I think in the Middle East, especially through Syria, we've seen the exact same thing.
Absolutely. I mean, look at Lebanon, exactly the neighboring countries. Turkey is hosting around 4 million, Lebanon 3, Egypt is hosting some, Iraq is hosting some in the area of Erbil in northern Iraq. It is absolutely crucial to have a say in the political stability in Syria, because then you elevate the burden and the stress that those neighboring countries that have already their own stress factors, right?
Yeah.
Now you're burdening them with refugees that have a right to a dignified life, have a right to education, healthcare, and I think the moral, ethical way to go about it is actually to help them go back and provide them with safe, definitely safe and dignified economic circumstances where they can come back and rebuild the country and go back to their villages and their lands and all those things. So it's not a solution to keep them in Lebanon, Iraq, even in other countries, but actually provide them with the circumstances to return and rebuild.
Let's talk a little bit about the geopolitics of the Red Sea, just to return to it quickly. The Evergreen incident recently in the Suez Canal was very interesting. I mean, it sort of highlighted just how fragile our global trades are, and it re-emphasizes the international importance of some of these real key infrastructure projects. Yeah. So it's been a few weeks, and I'm sure you've decompressed and thought about it a lot. Can you speak about this issue for us and explain what it means geopolitically for the region and maybe internationally?
So I like the analogy of comparing the maritime pathway to the maritime pathway of the Red Sea, connecting the Mediterranean with the Indian Ocean, and having those two important choke points, Suez Canal and the Bab el-Mandeb in the south on the Gulf of Aden, like the highway stretch from Maine to Florida. I don't know if you've visited the United States before, Brian, but we have a very significant highway stretch from Maine to Florida, from basically the northeastern corner of the United States to the southern tip of the United States. It's called the I-95, and this.
Yeah, I've taken it, not from the bottom of Florida up to DC.
Right? You have to take it, absolutely. Yeah. So one can imagine the crippling effect an accidental or intentional closure of one of those choke points on the flow of maritime, commercial, civilian, and military traffic, and the ripple effect it has on the stability and movement of goods and services and people, and the effect on insurance costs, the potential for military standoff. And 90% of the world's freight is moving by sea. Corporations and the governments alike will continuously monitor this pathway. For the Evergreen incident in the Suez Canal, I just wanted to emphasize, because I mean there was a lot of PR pressure on Egypt, and I just wanted to be a bit balanced about this. The Suez Canal is state-owned by the Suez Canal Authority of Egypt. The canal current capacity is about 97, I believe, ships per day, and it's about 220 miles long. At its narrowest point, the canal is 300 meters. I believe that's where the Evergreen was stuck. And those 6 days blocked about $9.6 billion of trade and held about 369 ships. So it was a very big deal. But Egypt's technical capacity and tugs were able to free Evergreen with help of Dutch and Italian tugs. And while Egypt has done a great job, acted professionally throughout the situation, the incident, as you rightly mentioned, brings fresh reconsideration about those difficult maritime chokeholds, but also about thinking about alternatives for man-made canals in the region. And such ideas have been interestingly developed by both Israel and Turkey. For example, Israel is promoting the Ben Gurion water canal that links the Gulf of Aqaba to the Mediterranean, which then creates an alternative route to the Suez Canal. This project will have significant consequences other than financial. It's the potential for integrating, for example, Jordan, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt in an economic and trade hub that benefits from trade and commerce flows from the Red Sea through the Tiran Strait, Gulf of Aqaba, and Mediterranean. Of course, Saudi Arabia had already talked about the mega smart city Neom on the far most western corner of the kingdom. Turkey is another example that is thinking about those redundancies, right? So Turkey is building building a redundancy or a parallel path through the crucial choke points between the Black Sea and Marmara Sea. So the Black Sea is connected to the Marmara Sea, which is connected to Mediterranean. That's, part of that crucial geography of that region. And they're calling it the Istanbul Canal. So the Istanbul Canal will run parallel to the Bosphorus Canal, and link together into the Marmara Sea.
Okay.
It is planned to increase capacity of shipping from the Black Sea, estimated cost about $9 billion. It's about 25 nautical miles, which is about, I think, 45 to 46 kilometers. Capacity 160 vessels per day. But you can see that, this is an alternative to a strait in the Sea of Marmara linking to the Mediterranean. And the crucial point about this canal is Turkey now thinking is that it can bypass the Montreux Treaty that is governing the Bosphorus Strait. So the Montreux Convention on Regime of Straits was signed in 1936, and it is an agreement giving Turkey authority over the Bosphorus, not just for civilian vessels in peacetime, passing of civilian vessels in peacetime, but also is restrictive about the passing of naval ships that do not belong to the Black Sea states. Mm-hmm. So the new strait, the Istanbul Canal, will allow Turkey greater autonomy and to bypass the Montreux Treaty, which is absolutely, that part of that geopolitical development that is happening in Turkey. Yeah, go ahead.
For people listening to get an idea for where these places are on the map, I'm just looking at a map right here.
Yes.
What's the major economic incentive for building a canal through Turkey? And it's this narrow point, which is sort of where Istanbul sits, right? So I imagine it would be left or right of that. What's the major economic incentive for getting access then to the Black Sea? Because I'm looking at the states that border the Black Sea, and I'm not envisioning too much trade coming through there. Maybe it's coming from the Far East on the train. I'm not sure. Forgive me if it's a bad question, but I'm
no. You're absolutely correct. So I believe from the Turkey government perspective, there are a lot of incentives of why this would be an investment-worthy venture to go forth. And the construction already has started on that project. Is that first there's, you're building an alternative route to the only linkage from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, which is through the Bosphorus first strait, and then the Dardanelles, which is at the end, if you look at the map, at the end of the Marmara Sea, connected to the Mediterranean. So that is one incentive. The other incentive is that precisely that point that can bypass the Montreux Treaty Agreement, where Turkey would then have the full say about what type of military vessels can access the Black Sea to the Mediterranean and vice versa.
Okay. Interesting.
That's a lot of incentive. And just think about the geopolitical leverage Turkey have through that canal. I mean, anyone, it didn't have to take an Evergreen incident to think about this. I mean, look at China of how they bypass the crucial choke point of the Malacca Strait, right? Most of their trade used to be running through connecting from China to the Middle East was 12,000 kilometers long through the maritime that is going through the Malacca Strait. Now with their construction of the BRI, they've connected a land pathway or an economic corridor.
Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah, absolutely. But it connects specifically the western region, the city of Kashgar, to the Gwadar port in Pakistan on the Arabian Sea. And that road from Kashgar to Gwadar is 2,000 kilometers long versus the 12,000 kilometers long through the Strait of Malacca, where they have to deal with the South China Sea tensions and the U.S. patrol and all that other stuff, right? Saving money, saving tension. I mean, all of those risk factors have basically bypassed with this road. Yeah.
And you mentioned this sort of power that it might give Turkey should they effectively build this strait. That's quite interesting geopolitically, isn't it? Because Turkey are this almost burgeoning potential superpower player maybe not superpower, but at least regional superpower.
Absolutely.
I mean, they have, a lot of the necessary variables playing in their favor. And this could just be a case of playing the cards, whether they are played right or wrong. But that's an interesting consideration there as well. But also, I just think to dumb it down a little bit for me to say something quite obvious. What's the incentive to, say, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative to cut a 12,000-mile journey to a 2,000-mile journey? It's to create more favorable trade for your nation, right? It's to create the infrastructure projects within for the various countries along where the Belt and Road Initiative might be made. Then what's the purpose of creating more favorable trade for your nation? It's to yield more leverage when it comes to maybe political relationships you might have around the world, and so on and so forth.
Creating markets. I mean, right? So if it's an export-oriented nation, correct, and they have satisfied to a certain extent their domestic demand in the past 5 years, I mean, they're necessarily, right, logically, they have to look for new markets. And if those new markets in their neighbor region, which is their natural extension, right, the natural near abroad or neighborhood, then they will have to create those markets. And how do you create markets? You improve the infrastructure, you improve the technological know-how, you train, you provide security, and that's exactly what that BRI, marching across from China through Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, with now the 25-year strategic agreement between China and Iran, right? Through Iraq, the Gulf region. I mean, they are creating the markets necessary for future China exports. That spans everything. That spans security, defense, commercial, auto, you name it. It's really spans everything. But they are building the infrastructure necessary for that. And of course, there are many trappings we could talk about with regard to that. Whether it's leverage, influence, right, or
sure.
Because of debt. Ratios and so forth, they could lease certain important ports along the way. So there's a lot there. It's a smart initiative, it's a strategic initiative, and it's the hardcore essence of China's foreign policy for the next at least 30 years, because they are projecting that BRI would be concluded by 2050.
Were you hinting at, Pat, a little bit of debt trap diplomacy there?
Yeah, well, that's the arguments, right? So there are many examples. Sri Lanka, for example, Pakistan has been voicing some concerns a few years ago, and they reached out to the Gulf nations to help them with their debt maturity and all that stuff. So there are concerns, but then China's rebuttal to that point is that, if you get a loan from the World Bank or from the IMF, there are also those issues where those loans become mature and then you have to pay them back. But of course there are different circumstances, but you can see that they have thought out that process where they call them easy loans with low interest rates, but it's definitely
there are other incentives for giving out the loan.
Absolutely It's a smart project. There have been some setbacks in some countries, especially now with the pandemic, right? But they seem to be marching forward with it.
You say they seem to be marching forward. You mean China and the Belt and Road Initiative?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, no, certainly. That was definitely a question that I wanted to ask you more about, but I think you did a very good job speaking a lot about it there. Could you just also take maybe a step back towards the beginning of the Belt and Road and explain specifically where the infrastructure project is starting, finishing, the countries it's going to go through?
Yeah, sure. So going back from the very beginning, just how I came to understand the BRI. I can understand the BRI to, when it's called a strategic initiative of the 21st century, a significant transitional infrastructure project. But I really believe, as I mentioned, that it is meant to be the focal point of China's foreign policy, at least until 2050. And the BRI was formally integrated into the Chinese constitution in 2017. So you can see how much of an institutionalization is how this project is institutionalized in China that goes beyond the presidency term of President Xi Jinping.
Very interesting. Yeah,
absolutely.
That mustn't be a common thing that happens with infrastructure projects for different governments across the world. No.
It's precisely that. Whenever I mentioned the BRI, I mentioned this fact just to broaden the horizon, that this is not just an economic project that they have on the side of their foreign policy.
It's not doing this political clout or anything.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it is their foreign policy, and it spans now. If you have invested that many hundreds of billions of dollars across the broad from China to Europe, you are absolutely also committed to securing those investments, correct? So in parallel to this investment, you also are going to anticipate there are going to be security agreements along the way, military installations along the way. So that is absolutely what a foreign policy is, right? Those dimensions, economic, security, defense. It is just encompasses all of what foreign policy really entails, and that's why it's part of their 2017 constitution, and it just gives you an idea to the continuity, right? The intention of sustaining this policy across presidential terms and so forth. So the BRI was announced by President Xi Jinping 7 years ago. It's a it includes transportation hubs, ports, airports, railways, hydroelectricity, projects, telecommunication, in addition also to 50 economic zones spanning from China to Europe and Africa, including Africa and the Middle East. By 2018, there were 72 countries that have already signed the BRI, with 125 countries having signed some part of that, BRI-related agreement with China. Now, go ahead.
125 countries signing somehow an agreement with BRI. I mean, sure, it's not physically going through that many countries. Is that in regards to, say, developing whatever the trade agreements might be as a consequence of having the BRI? Is that where the 125 countries comes into it?
So there's an amalgam of that, right? So it has to do with actual territory linkages. It has to do with port relations. It has to do with logistics. It has to do with support of supply chains. I mean, there are many facets that have linkages to the BRI, where it does not necessarily include physical infrastructure connections between China and those countries. But 125 by 2019. I'm sure there's more now to count. Have been a participant in this, but this is something that China can then show the world of how much there's a buy-in, right? How much there is a buy-in into that international cross-border infrastructure project that is really, if you want to talk about geopolitics here, right? So that is really a geopolitical informed foreign policy for China.
You mentioned it's going to span across 50 economic zones at one point or another. I wanted to ask you quickly about maybe the ethics of the economic zone. Because you can criticize an economic zone that it will isolate whatever the upside is and not be further distributed to whatever the surrounding nation, city, area is that they might be located in. Is there a fear? Because for me, and this is obviously coming from relative ignorance to the topic, but if there are 50 economic zones, it sort of suggests they're highlighting these 50 points where all the upside is going to be generated, and it might perhaps then not trickle down or bleed down into the actual nation that the economic zone is harbored in.
Yeah, so how I think about it is that precisely just dovetailing on what you just mentioned, Ryan, is that it seems to be just guarantee stations, right? So you have those very concentrated, territorial spaces that are the economic zones across that territory that spans the BRI. So you are building redundancies and assurance hubs where control can be exerted, overview, mending, disruption, correct? So you have those different stations that become, part of that assurance or insurance that you build into the system in order to guarantee the flow, guarantee the continuation. And I think that's a very smart idea to actually think about that and then distribute it across the board. That builds a lot of redundancy here.
Apart from China, who's an obvious winner, who are the big winners of the BRI, assuming it is constructed and effective as they plan?
All right. So if you think about it, how much China has poured in with regards to the foreign direct investment related to the BRI, they have already invested more than $125 billion with the BRI in the ME. And we know that by 2019, this has increased to $240 billion. That is a 700
Casual bubbling.
increase. Yes, 700% increase since 2004 only. So between 2004 and 2019, there was a 700 increase in the FDI investment of China in the region. And yes, we have what we call traditional US allies in the region, but you look at the Gulf region, the Arab Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, they have all signed, and Oman, they have all signed, strategic, they have all signed BRI-related agreements with China, and it spans everything from infrastructure, oil refineries, security, surveillance, IT, you name it. I mean, it really spans the across the board. And what's interesting to me is that China is not just interested, well, it was at the beginning of it, very much interested in those economic agreements and infrastructure agreements. But now you see that the foreign ministry of China also is very interested in voicing its diplomatic role in the region. I mean, when have you heard before that China would like to host a mediation between the Israelis and the Palestinians, right? I mean, that's really interesting because it just tells you the confidence, right? It tells you the leverage. It tells you we're here and we want to have a role, and this is our neighborhood, right? We are invested in your well-being, and we are not shy from voicing our political leaning in this situation. But maybe it has a positive role. I think, for example, the Ethiopian, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, right?
Yes, the most unnecessary third word to a title ever.
Yeah. So the GERD, exactly. So there's a huge situation there. Ethiopia is willing to do a second filling of the dam in the month of summer in July and August, which has riled rightfully Egypt and Sudan, and they want kind of a formula for equitable water distribution. But you can see here that China really, there's something there. It has billions of dollars invested in Egypt. It has billions of dollars invested in Ethiopia. The China banks were the first investors in the construction of the dam. All right. So from that perspective, and having interest in actual tangible money, interest in both countries, they would be also situated to be a mediator, right? Because they really have actual vested interest to find a peaceful resolution to this crisis, this water crisis, basically. So I can see both ways where there is definitely a new way of China diplomacy that is very overwhelming and very there, right? In physical, tangible structures, workers, joint ventures, and all of that. But at the same time, the Chinese are slowly integrating their diplomatic flair, right? They're within not just Gulf states, but also in Eastern Africa, in Iraq, in Syria. You're hearing their voices, not just their economic fortitude. Yep.
And the more they're received and their power is exerted, the more it sort of doubles down their relevancy in the region.
But here's the catch, bro. If I may just catch up with this idea, is that but now China is really facing a crucial fork in the road, because now they cannot count on free riding on United States security guarantees in the region. The United States, all what's it called, the Carter Doctrine, that said basically that the United States is willing to mobilize military power in order to protect its oil interests and national interests in the Gulf region. Now the U.S. and the Gulf states are competing for markets for oil and gas, right? So the whole dependency on oil is now poof. So the China cannot, and China is depending on 40% of its oil export from the Gulf states. So now China cannot be a free rider on U.S. security guarantees anymore, and it has to provide its own kind of security policy in the region. So I think that's a new dynamic there that is unfolding. And now you have the United States and Saudi Arabia competing for market share in Asia. When have we heard that, right? And the whole calculus is changing now, which is really interesting to follow.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Whenever the sort of military and hard power becomes a variable dynamic in whatever the negotiation or geopolitics in, it sort of heightens the tensions, doesn't it? It makes everything a little bit more sharp, and if you extrapolate just to this, perhaps China trying to mediate for the GERD. I mean, I was under the impression that it was more China was the financiers of the GERD, and then Egypt is the strong US ally. And that was almost how they were sort of facing off against each other. But It's sort of news to me that perhaps China is also on the Egypt side as well.
Absolutely. I mean, there were, if you look at the communication infrastructure of Egypt, China investment is there. I mean, their primary IT and communication Chinese corporations are the ones that are very prominent in Egypt. In addition to thousands of businesses that have headquarters in Egypt and in China, and the cross trade is absolutely phenomenal. So really, I mean, yes, of course, Egypt is of course a U.S. ally, but look how Egypt is really trying to balance all those things, right? It balances its relation with China, and it also balances its relation with Russia as well. So it's not just a U.S.-China nexus, right? It knows how to have those connections and networks with Russia, China, and the U.S. So as far as I can see, Egypt is pretty successful, much better than how they used to be in the 70s and 80s.
To round off the Belt and Road chat, what you're making very clear to me is that it's so much more than just a transport infrastructure. It's way more than just, say, rail lines, roads, even though it might be called the road, and a part of the marketing is to harp back to the Silk Road of ancient trade times. But it's so much more than that. And I think that's something that you're, really making quite clear. The countries are buying in on a much more and a much less superficial level than just this is a means.
That's
from
the right way to say it. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
So, last two questions. These are a baseline for everyone, but particularly relevant for you considering the work that you do. So I typically ask, what is a country that the guest is most bullish on? But I need to ask yourself, what is the nation within the MENA region that you are most bullish on, and why?
That is a good question. There are a number of them. For now, in taking into account the current circumstances and how they seem to evolve in the near future, I believe United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and a number of others really have the foundation and have gone through the tough crisis. For example, the real estate and other crisis that the UAE was able to get itself out of and recover from. Egypt went into the free floating of its currency a few years ago, and it survived that, right? And reducing subsidies, and that's always a crucial litmus test for developing nations when they try to privatize, right, and reduce subsidies on certain crucial elements that the public relies on, and just taking on the mega infrastructure project in Egypt, and with their new administrative capital and so forth, and connected with the railroads. It is making major strides, and it's usually, something to be admired for a developing nation in the MENA region with its location that it's at. But it made smart moves, like, for example, their agreement with Cyprus, Greece, and Israel. I mean, they are trying to diversify as much as they can, but there's still that sticking point that I mentioned before with regards to the water scarcity. Sure. I mean, if water reached the 500 cubic meter per individual, that is very scarce. Absolutely, undeniably, very difficult living situation, but hopefully we will not get into that level of water scarcity in Egypt, and they will be able to either the African Union or the World Bank would be able to mediate, or China with the help of them, mediate between them and resolve it, because otherwise it would be very difficult risk factor for Egypt. UAE, we know a lot of things that they've been very, very successful done, their metropolitan area, their trade connections, and they're also very important balance that they are trying to strike with the United States. They are an important ally. And with China and Russia. I mean, that's another, so far, right? Crossing fingers.
Sure.
So far, an important nation that is able to preserve its linkages with an important traditional ally, the United States and Britain, but also with very important linkages with both China and Russia and Iran. So one of those metropolitan areas that are exceptional. Israel, of course, is another important country in the region. Very successful entrepreneurship in IT, R&D, and water provisions and water technology, and also Turkey, for example. I mean, there's a number of countries that
Sure.
that have the potential, that have the strength and the infrastructure to pull through difficult, rough patches that they might go through.
I really do want to hear more about Egypt, but we'll have to leave that for next time, because I'm quite fascinated to hear more why you're so bullish in that country in particular. But let me just tag on another one. Irrespective of what you think is the most bullish in reality, which in your heart do you want to see succeed the most?
I'm holding a special place for a lot of countries because not only because I visited them, I lived in many of them, and I know, once you know the people, right? Once you have faces to remember, right? The faces and places to remember in those, you always hold hope, and you know that you want to try to root for better circumstances. For example, in the case of Syria, for a resolution. It might be a perfect resolution, but we shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So sometimes people are more idealistic than what practical circumstances must be allowed to proceed, because it will elevate hunger, poverty, and let's not make the enemy of the good, of perfect be the enemy of the good in many cases. And I think one of them is Syria. A political resolution that allows people to come back and rebuild is good enough to allow for a dignified existence, better than that they have in Lebanon or Turkey or in other places. And in my heart, so Lebanon definitely, I would hope there are better circumstances. Iraq definitely deserves much better circumstances than they are currently experiencing, and Syria, yeah, definitely.
Okay, well, I mean, it's an hour has absolutely flown by. I could really do this for a lot longer, but I can't thank you enough for giving me the time, and thank you for your erudition.
I a lot. I didn't feel the hour, but yeah, I totally enjoyed it.
Fantastic. So yeah, thanks for coming on, and hopefully we'll do this again.
Okay, sounds perfect.